Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We'll give people a little bit more time to assemble. Always need to be close to them. Yes, absolutely. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brad Power, and I'm the director of the Community Development Department for the City of Englewood. And we'd like to welcome everybody who's joined us in person here in the community room. It's nice to see you. And everybody who's joining us online, thank you for joining us as well. So if you
Good
figured it
evening,
out or
Fran.
haven't figured it out, we're stretching the envelope a little bit tonight and using technology as part of our meeting. And I've noticed that some of you have already started to log in and look at the first question, which was give us something that you love about Englewood. So you see some of the responses there. Small town, feel, a lot of growth, walkability, that type of thing. So one of the things that kind of characterizes all of that in terms of what really makes a community are the people. But a close second to that is what the community looks and feels like in terms of its built environment. And one of the things that Englewood has is a series of rules and regulations known as our development code that essentially is the roadmap for everything that happens from the built perspective in Englewood. And that can be anything from a backyard fence in your home to if you look down the Englewood Parkway, you can see the big crane at Swedish Hospital building a big expansion and everything in between. So it's very important for cities to have those regulations that guide growth over time, and because it really reflects the feel and the look and the character of a community. And so, one of the reasons why we're endeavoring to do this exercise with you all tonight and over the course of the next several months in terms of rewriting our code is that we haven't done it in almost a generation. So, it's getting pretty aged in terms of trying to keep up with current building practices, the latest thinking in terms of how things are coming together in the way that people live, work, and enjoy their communities. So we are starting about a year-long effort, and have started about a year-long effort to go through all of our development code. So it's about a 3-inch thick book of rules and regulations. And so one of the things we want to do in that is get a sense of what the community's priorities are for the next generation of development and how it should be regulated in this community. So that's what tonight is about. I'd like to briefly introduce our consultant team and then our lead staff person. So Chris Brewster and Matt Ashby have joined us. They're here at the head table, and then Graham Smith is over here helping out as well. And at this point, again, I'd just like to thank you for joining us. Looking forward to an interesting evening and a lot of good exchange of ideas and priorities. And with that, I'd like to introduce Brooke Bell, who's a senior planner in our department, and he'll walk through a little bit of what's going to be happening tonight in terms of the outline of the meeting. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Brad. Put this back in here. Can everybody hear me? Okay. All right. Again, my name is Brooke Bell. I'm a senior planner with the Community Development Department, and I just wanted to go over some logistics for tonight, some housekeeping items, and as Brad mentioned, we are trying to do this meeting both in person and then virtually. So I want to go over some items. First of all, for our virtual audience, which you can see some of them right there on that screen, they're on a Zoom call. And so we're both live streaming this on YouTube for people who just want to listen or watch. They won't be able to participate if they're just on the YouTube live stream. And then we also had people who registered to participate on the Zoom call, and that's what you're seeing over there. So for those of you who are on the Zoom call, you can keep your video on or off. It's up to you, whatever you feel comfortable with. You can also utilize a renaming function in Zoom. I've never personally done that, but you could change your name or make yourself anonymous, I guess. If you know how to do that, I guess you can. And then right now, all the attendees on Zoom are muted. But during our question or discussion periods, if you want to ask a question or make a point in a discussion, just go ahead and raise your electronic hand. That's the little yellow hand on your computer. And then the chat feature is also enabled if you want to ask questions or leave a comment. And then lastly, in the chat, we've also included some links to some educational material if you want to look anything up. I don't know that you'll have a lot of time to do that tonight, but there is some backup material on all the topics we're going to be discussing tonight. So that's sort of for our instructions for our virtual audience. Um, and then for our in-person audience, at your tables, you've got a zoning map that's just there for reference. And then you've got a set of the issue papers for each of the topics. Again, that's information, background information. I don't think you'll have a lot of time to look at it tonight, or during this meeting, but it's there if you want to flip through it or get some more information. And then we also have these little pink cards on your tables. Those have the QR codes to be able to participate in the polling questions, and just by pointing your camera at it, it opens up a web page. Folks online can do the same thing with their phones. And when we actually get to the questions again, as Brad mentioned, we already actually the screen is up. So if you're at home, you can scan that QR code, or you can do it here on these pink cards, or even on the screen behind me. Then I did want to ask, if somebody does not have a smartphone but would like to participate, we have some extra just paper copies, and the results won't show up on our screen, but as each question is answered, you can answer on your paper copy, and then we'll collect those at the end to tabulate with the rest of what we'll find after this meeting online. And then lastly, does anybody need a paper copy, or is everyone going to use their smartphones? You'd like a paper copy? Okay. So yeah, you can just fill that out as we go. I wouldn't suggest filling it out ahead of time because you kind of want to fill it out as the information is being presented. And then lastly, we do have some of our planning staff here. We've got Will and Eric and John. If during the questions you need some clarification, you can raise your hand and somebody will try and come help you. With that, I'm going to just move on to how the night is going to kind of progress. And that is Chris Brewster with Gould Evans is going to kind of go through where we're at on the project, a project status, and a schedule that we're looking at. And then Chris is also going to go through, he's going to start out going through 3 topics: parking, walkability, sustainability. And what Chris will do is he'll give information on one of those topics, let's say parking, and then just to kind of bring everybody up to speed. And then Matt will be asking some questions. And so for each of those questions, that's how you'll be responding on your smartphones. And then at the end of those 3 topics, which will be around, it'll be after 7 o'clock, we will open it up to a discussion of the results, because you will be able to see your results collectively of this group up on the screen pretty quickly. And so at the end of those first 3 topics, we will open it up from some comments and questions, not only from our group in-person group, but also you can raise your hand if you're on the Zoom call, and we can ask those questions. Or if somebody puts a question into the chat, Nancy will help us read that question, and we'll try and do our best to answer that. So at about 7:20, we have this room from obviously 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. So about at the halfway point at 7:20, we'll take a little break, about a 10-minute break. You're welcome to have some cookies, grab a water, use the restroom, and then we'll reconvene at 7:30, and we'll go through a few housing topics. And we'll do it in the same format. We'll Chris will go over some of the topical information, and then we'll do some of the polling questions. And then at the end of that, closer to the end of the evening, we'll open it up again to talk about housing topics and anything else. So, did I forget anything?
You did pretty well.
And I think when we get to our first questions, other than what we've already had up there for what do you enjoy about Inglewood, I think, Matt, you can go over again how that'll work. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Brewster to go over our presentation tonight.
Thanks, Brooke. Before we get into the issues, I just want to give a quick background of the project for those of you that this is your first time joining us. For those of you that have been in our kickoff meetings, some of this will be a repeat. But as Brad mentioned, you don't get the opportunity to do this very often. Development codes are updated once every generation typically. So this is really an opportunity to set the roadmap for what your community becomes in the future as you experience the opportunities and pressure of growth. So we do look at it as how you build, design, and improve your community. So our main objective for this project, above anything else, is to make sure the development code builds expectations, whether that's through what the code requires, what the decision processes are, or what the decision criteria are for different applications. And it also needs to improve how development integrates into the community. So building expectations and making the document a more user-friendly, more engaging tool that implements your plan is really what we're getting at. And so these are some of the things that we always try to achieve in a development code. And these are the things we began looking at a little over 6 to 8 months ago, and we've been working with our steering committee on that. So that's what we're trying to get out of this above anything else. This is our project schedule. Again, we've been at this for a while, particularly if you're a steering committee. We have some steering committee members here in the crowd. If you want to raise your hand, they've been at this for a while, so we appreciate their involvement. There's some online as well. But we began talking about these issues back in September, really. And September through December, we engaged in some regular meetings where we covered a lot of these topics to figure out what it means to the development code. And so I'll cover that in a minute. Essentially, where we are right here is we're ready to really start the public engagement in full. If you were with us in February, we kicked off the engagement. We have a lot of online resources. Some of those are at your table if you're here, or if you're in the online meeting, the links Brooke mentioned that are in the chat. Those have been available for a little over 2 weeks now, and they will continue to be available. But they go into each of the topics we're discussing tonight a lot deeper and talk about things. So if you spent some time with those tools and resources, that's good. If you haven't, there's still opportunities even after this meeting to do that. But that phase 2 is all about getting feedback. And so tonight's our really first big public event for doing that. Going forward, there will be other opportunities as well as we begin to draft the code. I think the other key point about this slide of our schedule, we really aren't drafting any changes until we get some of this feedback. So that's phase 3, where we begin to piece together what we change in your development code, what we keep from the current development code, and what new things we need to add into the development code. So that's an overall picture of our scope. How did we get here? The city has been at this for far longer than us, and also some of our steering committee members. As Brad and Brooke mentioned, this is all about implementing your existing plans and policies, connecting the development code to a lot of things that have been done since the last time the development code was updated. So those plans and policies are our first set of marching orders of what we're trying to achieve. A little over a year and a half ago, the city also did a detailed code assessment that also had a robust public engagement with it. That document is online. And then, as I mentioned, when the city put out an RFP for this project, there were some more specific goals. So those things are all in progress well before we joined the team. And essentially, that code assessment came up with these 5 priority topics. Residential dimension and design standards need to be updated. Neighborhood character needs to be strengthened. We need to improve housing attainability. We need to address parking and walkability. And throughout all of that, we want sustainability and green infrastructure. So these are the issues our steering committee, this was the starting point for our steering committee in September through December. From there, we said, okay, what do those issues mean to the development code specifically? So the notes and input from those meetings are all online as well, but most of that went into shaping tonight's events and some of the online materials and ideas and issues that we need to be thinking about and considering. So the the differences here on this slide that I wanted from that previous slide is we broke walkability into two different components. That's going to be the first half of our meeting: street design and then parking. So that's different from the code assessment. And then the other one I did want to note is housing attainability. While many of the things we discussed tonight and in future meetings are going to impact housing attainability, there's also a separate tract that the city is pursuing through a DOLA grant that will look specifically at how the code changes we're considering address attainability and affordability, and we are going to be coordinating that with this project. So we won't dive very deeply into it tonight, other than we know that everything we talk about regarding housing will impact that. Just know that there's some additional research and data and engagement going on about that issue specifically that we'll be following on this project as well. And then the last part, the sustainability issue, as we discussed things with the steering committee, we started to realize that that's not necessarily a discrete topic, that everything in the development code touches sustainability in some way. So from the big picture to the small picture, and things inside the development code and outside the development code. So we really, instead of addressing it as a separate topic, we've integrated sustainability questions into every topic. So when you get to the polling, what you're going to see is a series of choices that look similar to this spectrum. And the way we approach it from a development code standpoint is coordinate means the development regulations won't really address the topic. Either it's not relevant to the topic, or other outside codes address it. A good example is sustainable buildings, energy efficient buildings. The zoning and development code doesn't really address that topic. Those are things that are handled by the building code. The city is looking at the building code on a separate issue of updating it to the more recent energy efficient codes, but it's not something our development code would address directly. It might be big picture things like preserving natural resources, or stormwater on the large scale that won't be affected by site development, but it's important to coordinate with the development code. Then we move into the range of spectrum where the code will specifically address it. So enable, it means simply remove the barriers. Don't require it, but allow it. So we're looking through the code to see if any of the standards prevent a more sustainable best practice. Promote might mean let's start to emphasize it or give incentives for doing something that's more sustainable, but we certainly aren't making it a regulation. Whereas require is saying, hey, let's take that sustainable best practice and make it the bare minimum that you have to do. So just keep that in mind as you look at and consider the sustainability questions. And when we get to those, you can feel free to ask questions on what exactly we're meaning. So with that, I was going to dive into the first issue, and our first issue is walkability and parking. So the current development code has parking requirements. Our assessment is they're pretty typical of most cities. There's a minimum parking for all areas, and it's assuming that we need to make sure that all uses provide sufficient parking, and it's typically free parking. The code has some ability to do flexibility, so some opportunities to maybe reduce the parking requirement if it's excessive, and it has some areas where there's an exemption. The Broadway corridor, for example, those uses don't have to provide parking because of the distinct pattern in that area. And it does have some pretty basic landscape standards for screening and making parking more attractive. But it doesn't necessarily emphasize sustainability aspects of parking or look at the impacts that surface parking has. Your plans are suggesting that you need to prepare for a more multimodal future, and you need to start integrating better practices as far as design and mitigating the impacts of parking, whether it's aesthetics or whether it's environmental impacts, stormwater, heat island. Those are some of what your plans and policies suggest. And the steering committee discussions talked about, let's optimize parking. Too much parking is just as big a problem as too less parking. The answer to that question of what's the right amount might be different in different parts of the community, whether you're transit adjacent or whether you're on a more car-oriented corridor might impact that. And then also not pushing too far. There was a strong discussion in the community of let's not put in standards that we're not ready for. So that balance of preparing for technology in the future, EV parking versus are we ready for that now? So that's an ongoing discussion with the committee. Just a few quick facts about parking that kind of maybe alter our perspective on how we think about regulating for parking. and these are not necessarily Inglewood specific, they're general to every city, is parking has a cost. It has a pretty large financial cost right out of the gate for development, but it also has an opportunity cost. It's space that's being used up for essentially a not productive use. Um, there's large areas of our community are dedicated to surface parking. We don't always recognize that, but there's some large quantities of space being claimed by parking. And then in Inglewood, as in many cities, some areas are overparked. There's more parking than is needed based on the context. So that's usually the case in every city. And the state of the profession, planning profession, and what communities wrestling with these issues are dealing with is, A, they're trying to get to the right number on any different project. And the right number is usually something that you don't always know. We can't write it in a code and it magically is the right number. So integrating flexibility in your development code will be important. Trying to reduce it as a cost to, particularly in a community that's doing a lot of infill development as you are, trying to look at ways that are sensitive to the cost aspects of parking. And then lastly, most communities are wrestling with the same issues your steering committee has been discussing. How do we make sure there's parking is designed in an environmentally sensitive way? How are we preparing for the technology of transportation in the future, whether that's managing the parking supply through technology or whether it's designing parking lots to prepare for the future of transportation and technology. So with that, our online materials did show this is an example of what your development code may require. So you have parking requirements, and so in a typical office development, there's the ratio of building to parking area. The darker gray is the building, the lighter gray is about what will be required with parking. In retail, you have two scales of parking. The smaller retail stores actually provide about half, whereas the larger retail stores provide about equal building to parking. And then as we get to other uses, you can see the parking footprint increasing, becoming a larger and larger component of development. And then the upper graphic shows that we see those results in your community. So our questions are, I'll turn it over to Matt to get ready for the polling now. We're going to ask a series of questions that help you direct us on how we should be thinking about parking.
Okay. Yeah, so if if there are any folks that are new to the room, we do have cards with the QR code. If you scan that with the camera function on your phone, you can pull up the website that will load these questions and you can interact that way. If you would like a paper survey, go ahead and just raise your hand and staff in the back will bring that up. So when was the last time you were in a meeting and somebody said, hey, pull out your phone and stop paying attention to us? It doesn't happen that often, but this time we're actually going to encourage that. So the first question that we have is, how do we adjust parking requirements to optimize the amount of parking provided? Option A is to reduce the minimum amount of required parking so that property owners can provide less if they feel they need less. Option B is to implement hard maximums. Don't allow more than is required. Implement a soft maximum that would allow folks to go over a basic requirement with other mitigating factors or design features. Option D would be to expand exemptions or credits that allow for staff or planning commission to accept less parking based on circumstances or criteria. And option E is to make shared parking easier so that nearby sites can either consolidate parking with sharing or be more efficient with different peaks in parking and demand times. So uses that might be complementary and have a shared parking option. So with this question, it is a multiple choice. You can vote for multiple options if you think a couple of those are good ideas. So with that, we do have some results. It looks like we've got folks looking at setting maximums with flexible options is a popular option. Streamlining shared parking looks to be getting some votes. But I think what you're seeing here is that there is no silver bullet on this item. It's probably a cross-section of all of these items that we'll be looking at within your development code. So we'll go ahead and a couple of seconds here before we move on to the next question, if you want to lock in your answers. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to question number 2. Yeah, we can. Yep. So question number 2, what physical aspects of parking do you feel are important to consider in the code update? A, limit overly large surface parking areas. B, provide landscape materials within and around parking areas. Option C, mitigating the impact of surface parking on the public streetscape. D, buffer and screen parking from adjacent properties. And E, focusing attention on parking to our more walkable and transit served areas. Again, options for multiple answers on this question. Got some answers coming in. Looks like popular one is A, limiting overly expansive parking lots. Landscaping appears to be important. Focusing on walkable and transit areas. And some votes for buffering and screening for neighbors. So again, interesting division of answers on this one. It's pretty well across the board on most of the answers, with buffering and screening from the street on the tail end. So, all right, next question. What sustainability issues are important as we consider our parking standards? This is a little bit different of a question. Would encourage you to turn your phone sideways because it'll be easier to see, but you are able to essentially tap on one of those 4 squares. So regarding parking and sustainability, how should we address things like heat island impacts from paved areas? Options on this might include more shading, altering the pavement color, reduce pavement, and other solutions like that. So if you want to have coordination take place, if you click on the box that is furthest to the left, if you think enabling and removing barriers is the way to go, that is the second from the left. Promoting is providing incentives for selecting the best practice, and all the way to the right-hand side is requiring, making the best practice the minimum standard. You can, exactly. So that gives us a little bit of an idea of kind of where you are on that spectrum and where you think we should start to focus our efforts. So very good. We've got the next question regarding parking and sustainability is related to promoting alternate transportation modes. So things like EV charging stations, bike parking, rideshare pickup areas. Should we be coordinating those efforts? Should we be requiring those efforts, or somewhere in the middle? All right, and these items are being recorded as far as us being able to come back to these so that we can analyze them and figure out how to move forward. But it's really given us a good snapshot of where folks think we should head with some of these issues. We've got one more question that's similar regarding parking and sustainability, regarding stormwater management. So should we be considering options like landscape design, different paving techniques, possibly including permeable paving and things like that, to look at addressing parking and sustainability? Again, should we be using a light touch to just coordinate, or should we be looking at promoting or regulating those items? Very good. A little bit slightly different responses on this one. So good to see that that response from you all. Yeah. All right, question number 4. And let me get my page turned here. Regarding parking and other characteristics. So, what other characteristics of parking do you feel are important but may not have been mentioned here yet? So we've got, this is kind of like the first question with the word cloud. So if you want to type in any characteristics of parking that maybe we missed or you think are critically important that we should start to focus on. Free parking to remain. And just a note, if you do have a phrase that you want to type in, if you put dots or periods between it, so it's all one word, it will keep it all together as a string. If you have multiple words and you put a space in between, it will separate those into 2 separate words. So. Very good. And one other thing to note, the number of times a word is mentioned, it starts to grow larger. So we've got parking, buildings, streets, transit, security is in there, multimodal, curb cuts, reduced curb cuts, repurposed parking, maximize, flexible use, snow plowing, encourage gardens. Fantastic. Well, you guys are really getting the hang of the online technology here, so it's great to see the feedback. So thanks for providing that. So that wraps up our discussion of parking at this point.
Yeah, and we'll come back. We can come back to all of these when before we go to break. We're going to have a broader discussion on all of these topics. So I'm going to move on to our second walkability topic, and it's walkability and streets. For this one, I do want to just make one note up front. The development code won't regulate different streets into existence, particularly in a community like Inglewood. You're built out, your street grid is established, your streets are built. So just because we put something in the regulations won't mean that your streets transform. However, it is important to have street standards in the development code for 2 main reasons. One, a lot of times as redevelopment occurs, those give staff a cue of what types of improvements need to be made in association with development on an incremental basis. So for example, if a project's being developed and the sidewalks or the streetscape design is substandard, you look to the development code of what they should be required to put in as development occurs. So that's one thing. The other reason is, as you'll see when we get into some of the design issues, the streets provide a big cue for how development should be regulated. So if you think for development along Hamden might be quite different because of that street design as it is along Broadway. And that's largely because of the context established by the streets. So the street designs do give us a good cue for how development regulations should be written as well, what the private property owner should do in response to that context that's given to them by the street design. But other than that, most of the improvements of streets through the city are going to be done through capital investments. So they won't be necessarily regulated into existence other than the 2 areas I spoke about. But still, those capital investments could be guided by what we put into this development code with regard to street design. So currently, your plans are suggesting planning for a multimodal future, better walkability, better transit, better biking throughout your street system. And it's also suggesting that streets do a lot to shape the character through the landscape and streetscape designs that are put in. Your current development code, and this is different from other areas of your city codes that address streets, but your current development code just has some basic standards for right-of-way width, street width, and sidewalk width. And they're kind of a bare minimum. They're not necessarily shaping different contexts in your community. So the steering committee has discussed these issues, and the direction was that we need the unified development code, the updates we're doing, to coordinate better with all of the city's street plans, including the standards that Public Works has, some of the street plans, and the walk and wheel master plan that's been done. So the development code needs to help coordinate with those types of things. The committee also discussed strong multimodal aspects, different street types for different locations. So what are your bike streets? What are your transit streets? What are your walkable streets versus what are your more car oriented or traffic oriented streets, or how do we balance those? So that idea of different street types in different contexts. And then the last thing I think that's been discussed is we need to be thinking of streets as social spaces. They're the most important public space you have, and so the standards should be geared towards that. So a few quick facts, playing off of that, what the steering committees discussed. Usually in a typical city, streets are about 20, streets and right of way are anywhere from 25% to usually upwards of 40% of your entire land area. So that's saying private property is 60 to 75%. Streets are a huge component of your city. So how well you design your streets really determines a large chunk of your community. They also have costs and big costs. And so making sure that those investments are really driving value to your community as well is an important thing. And then the last part, your community is one of the most well-connected, gridded cities we've ever worked in. And so take advantage of that. So a 15-minute bike ride is about 9 square miles. That's 1.5 times of your entire city. So you can cover, an average person could cover your entire city easily in a 15-minute bike ride. 15-minute walk is about 1/12 of your entire city. So an average person could easily cover 1/12 of your entire city in a 15-minute walk. So that gives you an idea of the scale and the opportunity you have in this community. The state of the profession, what are other cities that are wrestling with this issues doing? For a long time, the idea of context-sensitive street design has been important. In other words, designing the streets to better support the land uses and development that are going up against it. Having complete streets, in other words, designing streets for the most users possible. Here we try to make a distinction that not every street needs to be everything to everyone, but complete streets is more about looking at a particular context and going, what users are most important in this particular street. So that kind of plays into number 3, that our streets should transition. The design of them may transition through different areas. In other words, the same street might be designed differently in one area versus another, or they may even transition block by block depending on what's going on alongside of it. And then connectivity, return on investment, again, getting value from the large public investment and actually long-term maintenance that goes along with those streets. And then the last aspect is focusing on the frontages. That's the most valuable part of your city. It's where development and public investment interface right along the frontage. So you'll see when we get to other issues on the development code, we focus a lot on how that frontage is designed. That's the public realm. Context is creating something. The development needs to respond to it correspondingly. This is some of the online exercises that perhaps you might have engaged in already. Look at what your current development code says. The above would be the typical cross section that could come out of your street. So as I mentioned, all it really has is right of way width, street width, and sidewalk width. It doesn't look at it from a design perspective, whereas the bottom would be what some of those state of the profession issues I was talking about would suggest your street standards should be.
We're back to the polling questions. So if you want to get your mobile devices back out again, our next question is, what street design elements are most important to encourage walkability? And so you're encouraged to identify any that you feel are important for walkability. Lane width, and this is important because it can impact the typical speed of cars. Wider lanes would encourage faster speeds. On-street parking, which can buffer sidewalks from moving vehicles. Bicycle facilities, which increase multimodal accessibility to different destinations. Landscape or streetscape, which can serve environmental purposes. establish character and provide a more comfortable public space, or sidewalks for more direct, safe, and comfortable walks. So different elements that might be important. So it looks like sidewalks are definitely key. We've got landscaping and streetscape, and many of the other elements are recording votes as well. So parking is a buffer. Very good. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. What elements are important to encourage a positive environmental impact? And again, we encourage you to identify any that you feel apply. Reduced street width to limit the stormwater and heat island impacts of paving. Green infrastructure, which would be including design and construction practices that limit environmental impacts. Again, landscaping and streetscaping to include street trees that add summer shade, filter rain, and improve air quality. And D, pervious sidewalks and pavement that would allow stormwater to infiltrate. All right. Looking like landscape and streetscape is an important critical one. Green infrastructure as well, and also some interest in the other topics. So, very good. Well, we'll move on to the next question, and this is an open-ended question for you. What other characteristics of street design are important that maybe haven't been mentioned or that you want to make sure are highlighted for us here? So again, open-ended question for you to answer in the form of a word cloud. Got some answers coming in. Bus transit, definitely an important feature. ADA accessibility, sidewalk width, so having a little bit more nuanced approach. Universal design, so accessibility. Adequate storm drainage. I see one on weed maintenance and weed mitigation. Green medians. Thoroughfares. Flowers. Separated bike lanes. And these are coming in fast, and I'm having trouble focusing on any of the words. So, bike lanes, snow removal in there again. Fantastic. Footbridges. Excellent. Well, very, very helpful. Again, we'll be downloading all of these and identifying some of these key items and how they might be integrated into the development code. All right, so that brings us to the end of our first couple of topics. So with that, we're going to open it up to discussions and question and get a little bit of dialogue going here in the room. The first question we have, with respect to some of those questions, were there any surprising results that came up? Either things that you were surprised as far as the results that showed up on the screen, or anything that maybe we missed that you'd like to be sure to highlight in the discussion. So we do ask that if you would raise your hand if you'd like to contribute some ideas, to raise your hand. We do have a microphone traveling around the room, and want to be sure to have your question into the microphone so our folks online have the ability to hear the question. So any thoughts, any items that surprised you? All right, thank you, Nancy. All right, Kathleen, I think if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I think we might be getting overdeveloped, at least in the medical corridor. We've had, there was a single family house across from us. Now there's 12 units there. And we've had two blackouts, I think, and we've had trouble with Comcast, and I think because it's overdevelopment. So I wonder what's being done about that.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the comment as best I can. We had a little bit of trouble hearing you. I think it was related to utilities and development and potentially having some blackouts on service. Is that correct?
Yes, it just seems like there's such a strain on all the infrastructure right now, at least here in the medical corridor, that they building left and right and causing a lot of problems, I think.
Okay, very good. So, development causing a strain on utilities. I think, as far as the development code goes, one of the objectives is to make sure, related to traffic and other infrastructure, that the code sets out sufficient requirements to be able to address that growth. Anything additional as far as comments from staff that might have more insight into that issue? Okay. Well, we have a comment in the front here, and then we'll go to you.
I appreciate the comment. I'm also in the medical district and experienced those two blackouts from my persistent pestering of Excel. Those were actually both trees that went down that knocked down infrastructure, and so obviously that's going to be a hard thing to alleviate. That said, we do want to make sure the development's in the right place and it's doing it in the correct fashion. So, there are feelings to neighborhoods and things like that that may not be medical district might be more dense, but maybe there's single family areas and other places, and I know that might be a change in some of those portions, but at least if we can make it cohesive and in the right places, I think that's what the development code hopefully can accomplish.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess, I think that person on the phone raised a good question. In the building code, should there be a responsibility to ensure that the development doesn't injure the neighbors, either their Wi-Fi or their solar panels on the roof, or in some cases around town, when the big building has runoff and the runoff runs onto the next door neighbor's property and floods the house. I think those specific things must be incorporated into the plan. And it's, I guess, in my view, it's up to you all to enforce those rules when they're done.
Very good. Thank you for your comment.
I have one comment regarding the streets and the widths and everything is kind of that you talked about have been promoting, less parking. I read these sheets and I say, I see less parking, narrower streets, things like that. That's a real big concern when you live in Colorado, because Colorado, you come here to go to the mountains, to go skiing, go do these things. When you put a 150 unit apartment complex up and you say one parking unit or 1.5 parking spaces per unit, you got two people in an apartment, there's two cars. And now we're talking about narrowing streets, making sidewalks bigger, reducing the transit and trying to be a transit oriented. Well, RTD doesn't take you to the mountains. It doesn't take you to St. Mary's Glacier to hike. It doesn't do any of those things. So when we work on code, when we talk about code, we we can talk about the multimodal transportation, or whatever you want to call it, the buses and so forth, but those things don't really take us to what we came to Colorado for, or live here for Colorado for. So we can't forget that we need to accommodate people here that are here now. Yeah, electric cars, but they're still cars. So we need to make sure there's enough space for all those things to happen. You know, the development we do, we tend to bring in more people in a smaller space, but we don't allow for them to have their space. You know what I'm saying? So just let's not forget that when we start to talk about, you know, reducing parking spaces and reducing all these things, we need to be aware that a lot of time when people come to Colorado, they come to do things and they have a car and they have to get around. And you can say it takes 15 minutes to cross town on a bike. Well, if you live over here by Bellevue Park, you got one heck of a hill to go up. It's going to take you 10 minutes to go up the hill, let alone to get to downtown or downtown Englewood. So I think it's kind of false to say you can cover 9 miles on a bike. Yeah, maybe in Holland where it's flat as a piece of plywood, but here it's not. So, you know, we need to kind of look at it realistically and look at, you know, statistics are one thing, but reality is another. So let's make sure we take that into account.
Very good. Thank you for your comment. Okay, I think we've got one more here.
Yeah, one of the items that seems to be missed is alleys and the maintenance of alleys and trash trucks. I think we're trying to address that in a different issue, but those are two things I think we've missed.
Very good. Thank you. We'll go to online question. Kathleen.
I just wanted to follow up on the Excel saying that the trees caused the blackout. After the second blackout, they had somebody digging up the driveway here to get to a cable box. So something was not affected by trees. And I think that was probably caused by overstrain.
Okay, very good. We also have a comment from Eli. If you'd like to.
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. So when it comes to the bike lanes and reducing parking, I would like to point out on the Sobo, like South Broadway between what is that, like 3rd Avenue and Alameda. They really, when they added the bike lanes there and kicked out the parking, it's a real mess to get through that part of town now. So I'd like, you know, if you're going to redo some of the lanes, I would try to keep that in mind of an example of what not to do. And then if we're going to repave and I'm not sure if they were going to repave, if you're planning on repaving, but I'm looking at, you know, the power lines in the back and how they're starting to rot out. And I'm wondering, is it possible to bury the lines at that point?
Very good.
That's all.
Thank you for your comment. Do we have any other in the room? There we go. And then I saw a hand.
Okay, mine's more of a question, and I hope I get it answered tonight. But there just seems to be a lot of crime and a lot of eyesores around apartment buildings. There's just overflow parking. I know there's adequate parking in these apartment complexes, but people choose to park on the street. Is there anything in the works where you have to have permit parking or ask the apartment complexes to be good neighbors? Park in your own damn complex and stop parking on my streets. There just seems to be a lot of crime and a lot of abandoned vehicles that aren't being addressed.
Okay.
So
Very
Those
good.
are the things that I see.
Yeah.
And there's Cherry Hills Vista, there's Golden Nugget Apartments, any apartment complex that has high density. There's just overflow parking and it's just flooding the streets and it's just is bringing the city look down.
Okay.
It's frustrating.
Very good. I think certainly the parking requirements are part of that conversation of this code. I think the coordination of other abandoned vehicles or crime would be a coordination issue with the enforcement, either police or code enforcement. So that might be one of those issues that's more of a coordination type of effort long term. So, yeah, thank you for your comment. Yes.
I just want to say something else about parking. When a complex is built, and it doesn't have to be a 300 unit complex, it can be a 12 unit complex. They all tout how much parking they have. The issue becomes for a developer is that they use the parking lot as a profit center. And so they will charge depending upon where it is. So you can put that in your code and you can say, well, we've got 2 spaces per unit, which is great. But the thing is, if you can park on the street for free, that ain't right for the people that live in a in a private home or a small multifamily, and it takes up the entire street parking because and then their lot is essentially empty, and yet they abided by all the codes.
Very good. Thanks for that insight. That's really helpful. Other comments?
Hi. So we've never met before, so this is a little awkward, but I'd like to address your comment specifically in regards to the whole RTD issue versus, parking minimums and whatnot. I agree. RTD is a mess. I am a huge proponent of change in RTD because I don't think it serves the population here effectively. It doesn't serve in terms of public transit. It does not get people to the mountains necessarily where they need to go. So I do agree with you on that. I just think specifically focusing on providing parking in regards to, I'm trying to think of how to word this, as the sole solution in keeping people in a specific amount of cars per lot may not necessarily be the way to address that. Maybe we can provide ways to have, car share. Maybe we can provide ways to provide people with RTD subsidized passes to go do different things. They do have the bus staying and snow staying for as limited as those are. There are different ways besides just providing parking, and we can provide different multimodal transit options to get around. And I agree, like the parking situation is frustrating because it's just, you feel limited by it, right? But I feel like there's other ways of compensating that aren't necessarily just keep as much parking, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you. Other comments in the room?
My question is, well, first of all, I'd like to rename Old Hamden Icebox Road because of the apartment complex you have there. And in the winter, it's going to be an icebox. And I used to work at Swedish Hospital in the grounds department there. And we kept the little road, well, the section of the road, between the south parking lot and 601. That was our area. We cleaned it. We took over that area from the city. We had backhoes at that time. But anymore, it's just an icebox. And I don't think you can widen that street. And now they're building some monstrosity apartment complex over where the Caribou Coffee Shop is, and that where it used to be a mortuary there. And that whole area is to me, it's just being trashed out. And I know the more people we have here, the more business we have here, but again, we are limited here. And Denver's a little lost child here. They're starting to come down this way. The traffic, etc. So I don't know what we can do on our little island here and coordinate with Littleton or Sheridan. but that road's going to be horrible. Then, of course, you got the road right behind it where the ER is. And there's no parking there. I mean, you have signs all around there, those people's homes, which I don't blame them. Don't park here. It's my home. But, of course, no one's going to pay attention to it. Like most signs, people don't pay attention to. But anyway, that's my little comment. So, can we change the name of the road to Icebox Road? I mean, it's going to be horrible.
I think so. Yeah,
I mean,
that would be a coordination issue. So
Snow went sitting right in there, and the way Swedish is building everywhere, I don't know. And you mentioned about traveling to the mountains. I mean, you know, like we're a California light, you know, anymore. So it's kind of sad, but that's life.
thank you for your comments. Anybody else in the room? We're doing good on time.
The city does need to get some solar regulations going, like the buildings that are causing the icebox. In December, the sun angle is 26 degrees. So basically, what that's doing is, if you have a 100-foot building, you have a 200-foot shadow. The shadow's twice as long as the height of whatever you're casting the shadow. So that if there's no solar regulations, then people are going to build wherever they want and however high they want, and it's going to cause some real issues for neighbors. Or solar and wind power are going to be the sustainable power sources that we have in the future. So we need to do something about the solar. We need to have some regulations on that. And as far as parking, if the city's going to go to paid parking, there needs to be some kind of regulations on that. You know, as how many spots per block or whatever. But electric vehicles, there needs to be some kind of regulation on, like, 10 parking spots has 1 or 2 electric spots, electric charging stations. The electricity is going to be the electric vehicles. I just heard today that California will not be selling any gas vehicles, new gas vehicles, in 35. So they will not have any new gas vehicles in California. And that's quite a change. It's a big change. So we need to get ready for that.
Is it possible, perhaps, to have one major parking lot and then like the mall shuttle in Denver, where you just park, you know, I mean, people have to get used to the fact that we've got, I mean, I haven't done any studies on this, but probably twice as many people as we used to have. You get one parking lot, great. I mean, it can be a multi-structure, a multi-story parking lot, and then you get a shuttle that runs up and down fairly constantly, so that, you know, you're not, you know, then you know, that it has room for bikes. It's closed to private vehicles and even Lyfts and Ubers. I mean, you know, that's life, folks. I mean, you got more people here than you've ever had before. I know the census said it in Denver, it actually shrunk up a little bit by 6,000 people. That's not going to last. And certainly Englewood isn't going to last. I mean, it isn't going to last if it shrunk at all. And I didn't see the figures on that. But I mean, there's certain, you've got to accommodate the fact that we're in a, not you per se, but we're in a changing world. and that seems to be like, you get one shuttle going north and south, maybe one shuttle going east and west. You could have a couple of different shuttles, smaller ones, not like these big articulated buses that now have 3 people on them. But you could, and people have to walk. Everybody talks about walkability. That's great. And I realize there are people who can't walk, and I think there are accommodations that can be made for folks like that. I mean, I might be one of them, like real soon.
Very good. Thank you for your comment.
I have a question for the committee because this is my first time being here. A lot of what has to be done code-wise, especially since this seems to be a 20-year process, seems to me that projecting demographics is really important based upon where we're heading as a town. We know that housing prices have gone up. That is going to affect the demographic of who is coming in, the income levels, the number of cars they have, the number of other vehicles they have. Are they working at home? Are they needing transportation to get there? And what's going to happen in 10 years based upon those projections? I think that's really where this code committee should be looking, not next week, but in a decade.
Thank you. Great point. And I think one of the important things that I've learned in generating and working on these types of codes is that it's important to create a framework that allows for flexibility in the future to be able to adjust. That this isn't a one and done kind of thing, but that it allows for growth and change. Just thinking a couple of years ago, the changes to the transportation system in this community have been dynamic over the last 20 years. And so having a code that you have the ability to make adjustments to and refinements to, I think that's one of the most important things of updating a code, is to be able to provide you with a system that you can start to work with. So thank you for your comments. We are getting to about 7:15. We want to make sure to be able to have plenty of time for the housing topics that we'd like to explore. We'll go ahead and take about a 15-minute break, but I want to make sure that folks are aware of the Inglewood Engaged online portal that provides for, again, much of the information that was briefly covered today in even greater depth. And it also provides for a comment form that if you have other ideas that maybe we didn't hear tonight, or that come into your mind later tonight as you're sleeping or staying awake and thinking about these issues, you can submit those comments online, and that'll come directly to the city and the steering committee to consider. So with that, we'll go ahead and take about a 15-minute break and reconvene at 7:30. And there are refreshments and restrooms down the hallway. So thank you much. We'll be back in about 15 minutes. start our conversation on housing. So we're going to dive back in and start on our housing discussion. So with that, and don't make Brad whistle. So he's ready. All right. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started on housing options and neighborhood character.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, the code assessment and our steering committee discussions that verified that had housing grouped into three main issues that are all interrelated: providing housing options, protecting and promoting neighborhood character, and then addressing housing attainability. So all three of those are going to be addressed throughout this code update. And again, the attainability part is going to be supplemented in a separate scope item that's going to coordinate with this, but it's being funded by a DOLA grant that the city's engaged in a contract to look specifically at some of the affordability and attainability issues. And mainly some of the outcomes of this meeting and our initial drafts of the code will be assessed for, are they addressing attainability or not? And if not, what other things outside of the development code need to be done? So for the purpose of this conversation, we're mainly looking at how do we provide more housing options, and then how do we do so in a way that protects and promotes neighborhood character.
Sorry, those attainability discussions really kick off during the summer months. So just keep an eye out for more information on those conversations.
So again, our kind of starting point, or what are your city's plans and policies? So quick summaries there. The plans are suggesting we need a balanced mix of housing. We kind of touched on some of these issues in our earlier discussions, but mainly to meet future needs. Things are changing. Demographics are changing, as was brought up. So how does the development code support or promote that, or not support that? Promoting walkability, bikeability, and development and housing is directly related to how you get around the community as well. Improving quality of life through neighborhood design, and then maintaining and improving the existing housing stock. Your current code already does provide for a wide range of housing options. There's 8 residential zoning districts total, which is a lot. And the steering committee's discussed, do we need 8? Or how do we maximize what we're doing with those 8 different districts? We have noticed are some impediments to what we would consider smaller scale development. It may have more units, but smaller scale buildings, there are some impediments that we've identified, and so we'll talk about those. ADUs are allowed. By ADUs, we mean accessory dwelling units. So can you have a unit and a subunit on your property? They're currently allowed, but in limited circumstances, and we'll talk about that. But overall, there's no clear, particularly when you get to the multifamily and larger scale projects, there's no clear pattern looking at the, from a small apartment building to some of the larger buildings that were discussed earlier. There isn't a clear identification of where and how those should go. So the steering committee discussed a lot of these issues, and this I won't go through all of them, but certainly the idea of being open to some of these building types that are being inadvertently weeded out through the development standards, exploring those and figuring out where and how they fit in. Considering reducing the lot coverage standards, but by that it means how much of a lot can a building cover in exchange for perhaps lower scale buildings was one option. The direction was to begin promoting ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in all districts, and then creating better distinctions between the 8 zoning districts we have, and making sure that the residential zoning districts are connecting with our plans, policies, and existing contexts. And then last, on character and identity, emphasizing streetscapes as one of the primary things, instead of just looking for what do buildings do. Again, that idea of how do buildings and sites relate to the street are all as important as the development standards themselves. So a few fast facts, and again, these aren't necessarily Inglewood specific, but just to get us in the frame of mind of thinking broader about housing. Transit-oriented development was mentioned earlier and discussed. Typically, when you have high frequency transit, you need about 15 to 20 units per acre to support that in a car light or a car free environment. So that's the target density for robust transit. So RTD is making investment in this area. Areas around those stations and stops should be shooting for something in that range. We also know that the average household size, the number of people per household unit, is declining. It used to be 3.14. It's now much smaller. While the size of houses is increasing. So there's a kind of a double whammy there. If we're trying to get more people in areas to support other things, the buildings aren't necessarily lining with that goal. One person households are on the increase. Are we planning for that? And then in general, the idea of walkability that's strong in your plans, you need about 5,000 to 10,000 households within the walkable area to support a walkable center. So are we thinking of those types of things? And again, these aren't Inglewood specific, but they're kind of benchmarks to frame our housing discussion. Communities that are wrestling with this are exploring the idea of promoting more mixed density neighborhoods. So not thinking of neighborhoods as this is all single family, this is all 2 family, but mixing types within neighborhoods, and how do you do that in a compatible way? Looking at your standards to create a building type approach. What we mean by that is it's not just focused on the density, low, medium, or high, or it's not just focused on the use type, whether it's single family, 2 family, or multifamily, but it's focused on what the actual dimensions of that building are. And so some of that will become evident as we go through our discussions. And when you do that, you can create transitions more effectively between different neighborhoods, between different projects, or maybe even on the same block. Promoting more missing middle housing, that's a term that stands for small scale but multi-unit projects. And then from the design perspective, again, focusing on the frontages, that how buildings and sites meet the streetscape shapes community character more than anything. So I'm going to address each of these issues that the steering committees discuss kind of individually and have some questions. And so we'll bounce back and forth between framing the questions and then asking them. So the first issue is accessory dwelling units, which again is allowing a secondary unit on property. So you might have your main house, but there's a secondary unit that can be used separately, but it has to be smaller and subordinate to the main unit. And so we've looked at some potential strategies, including a single ADU on property or multiple ADUs on certain properties. And if you engaged in the online interactive graphics, they went through some scenarios for that we will walk through with you. The current code allows accessory dwelling units in the R1C zoning district. If you have the maps at your table, you can kind of see where those are. And then R2 and MUR3, which are multiple unit districts anyway, would allow them by default. But essentially R1A and R1B, which are your larger lot residential districts, don't allow accessory dwelling units. And the current districts allow them with some design and operational considerations, some of which may be actual impediments to building these projects under the market conditions. And so the steering committee's direction was we need to be promote and be more open to accessory dwelling units in all zoning districts. So with that, it leads to our first question.
All right, so we are back to the online polling. Question 8, how should the development code update address accessory dwelling units? Should we allow and reduce barriers to ADUs throughout the city in all residential districts? Option B, permit ADUs but use limiting criteria, such as limiting the zoning districts only on larger lot sizes or only with specific building types. Option C, permit ADUs, but only in particular circumstances through special review. Or D, keep the standards as they are today. Or, and Chris provides, limit them further than they are currently today. Are we active? Okay, let's back up here. Folks, I'm not sure. We're having some technical issues here. I'm going to move it to question 9 and let's see if that helps. Okay. I don't know.
But did you ask the question 9?
Is it? Okay.
Question 9 showed up on our phones.
Okay. Is it back to question 8?
Is it working?
Is it back to question 8?
No, I'm still on question.
You're still on question 9. Okay.
But you're not on ClickShare, are you?
No, I'm not sharing at this point, so it's not responding. So.
Still on question 9.
Okay. Oh, I'm not online. All right, folks, sorry for the delay. We are not sure if the internet issues are causing some snafu here, but if you want to just make some notes on the paper in front of you, we'll kind of come back and maybe you want to do a show of hands and sort of old school it, or? Yes, we can switch folks to the online survey that will be available. I think some of the questions may still show up on your phones. They may not just transmit up onto the screen. So with that, we'll continue exploring the questions and maybe open it up after each session to a little bit of dialogue rather than consolidate everything at the end. So, good. Okay. All right. So we've got 3 questions on the ADUs. Question 9, should some lots be allowed to have more than one ADU? So the first answer would be all lots should be allowed 1 to 4 units, provided the permitted building types. Yep. There we go. So question 9, should some lots be allowed to have more than one ADU? First answer, A, all lots should be allowed 1 to 4 units, provided that the permit types and scale are appropriate. Option B, only on larger lots, so lots that would be 9,000 square feet and larger. Option C, only in certain zoning districts. So permit for detached houses and duplexes. And option D, limit ADUs to 1 additional unit per house. All right, and then the third question that we have is, what things are important to regulate when integrating ADUs within neighborhoods? Parking, lot coverage and open space, height and bulk plane, building massing and design, density, or other items. So with that, yeah, I think what we want to do is go ahead and open it up to conversation so that we can get some feedback while these questions are fresh in your mind. And I'm going to have you facilitate and see if I can use a different laptop to maybe get this working. So.
Yeah. So instead of holding till the end where we discuss all these issues, since we're not getting the online polling results, we'll just open it up to questions, concerns, thoughts on the opportunity for ADUs as part of the housing issue. So if you're online, raise your hand and we can unmute you. Or if you're in the room, just raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you to ask any questions or make any comments. Yes. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So the 3 questions again are, first, how should the code address accessory dwelling units? A reminder that the current code already allows them in R1C and up. So should it be more open to ADUs in all zoning districts? Should it be limited to certain districts? Should it be limited to special reviews? So you need a review of the project before you could do an ADU? Or should it keep the status quo or become even more restrictive than it currently is, or kind of the range of options?
So my comment was actually about the special review part of what you just said, which is I believe right now the code requires every ADU application to come in front of a committee and present it, and it becomes kind of a discretionary approval of some sort. So I would say that it's something that should be, have some more specific regulations for design and, how it fits onto the property and what's permitted, but then it should be a by right approval so that people can more easily get these built.
Yeah, she's right. There's already a design review committee. And one distinction that we could make in an accessory dwelling unit is, well, frankly, my example, I'm taking my garage, an existing building, and making it an ADU. But I'm going through the process right now that's been very, very difficult because they only know how to process it as a new structure. So my my general contractor is having a hard time just getting approvals and getting the paperwork to move because they keep sending him materials asking him for information about his new structure. This is a garage that we're just simply taking the existing structure and putting a house inside now. Um, that should be some kind of an exception. And then it kind of leads to the second question is I'm in a multi residential area. I'm in an MRU3. There's already apartments going up all around me and a townhome going on behind me. I should be able to have little or no resistance to creating this MRU, as opposed to somebody who's in an R1 district with just single homes all around. That would be my point.
Yeah, and that comment also brings up a point that some of our online materials emphasize that ADUs come in a lot of shapes and sizes. There's attached units, detached units, a basement apartment, garage apartment that's attached, or an upper level. So the whole goal here is to try to keep, if you're in R1 districts, to keep the development scale to the scale of houses and neighborhoods, but the units can be a little more ambiguous. As you move up into R2 and MUR3, there should be less resistance to different building types.
I'm not that, I don't know that much about ADUs, but would it be something like, let's say you owned an ADU for X amount of years, you wouldn't be able to sell that to make it a dual property on the same, on what once was a single lot. And I don't care if you're in an R1A, whatever.
Yeah, right. That's a good distinction. There's oftentimes there's a concern that, well, that now that it's a unit, it'll be separated. And the whole point of accessory is that it's incidental and subordinate to that main unit. So they go together as a package. So you couldn't, the city has lot standards and lot sizes that this issue is independent of. So you couldn't chunk off and sell that unit independently because it's on that lot with the unit.
And so it would be feasible then for an owner to become a landlord to the ADU.
Yes. Okay. And that also brings up another point that our committee has discussed. And I think if you were here at the kickoff meeting, I think a member of the public raised as well. One of the ways cities frequently address ADUs is they say it's fine as long as an owner is either an occupant of one or the other units. And so that's a common standard, and I believe the city has that standard now in there. However, when you think of in the R2 and MUR3, there are already buildings where the owner isn't a resident of them. So is it fair to make that requirement on that particular housing format? A lot of communities here, if you're in an area where there's a market for different ownership and rental formats, that provision can be a detriment to building more ADUs because the owner may not always be there. Any other thoughts or questions? A couple of our other questions are, oh, okay. Oh, okay. Eli, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't. Okay, thank you. So with, thinking of new buildings, I know it's been addressed a little earlier in the meeting, but, one thing that would add, keep the character of the neighborhood, as you said, would be the height. And then as some other folks were saying, if the buildings are on the north side, and I saw that there were townhome or row homes that could be, put on the boulevard side of a street in a bigger lot, that would cause a lot of shadows and cause more ice rinks. And, I've seen this, I have a family member who lives up north, and she says that that's really, that's huge for safety, for driving. And then keeping the height down would also keep the character of the neighborhood appropriate. And then another thing that kind of happens up north with a lot of the redevelopment is the buildings are So like they're really large and bulky on the lot. So I'm wondering if we can put a maximum percentage of what the lot is used for the actual building instead of so that way there's extra yard space and some sunlight coming through. And then yeah, I mentioned the row houses trying to be, trying to keep them on the north side of the street or the south side of the block or the west side of the block as well for snow melt. And then and if we do, and if this is permitted with the review, could we, would that be possible to have it as the ADUs are limited per block, so that way not everybody turns their house into a 4-unit house and it's just all of a sudden a whole row of houses up and down a single block, but having it be a certain percentage. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. These were good comments. The one that would concern me is the last one, because usually in the zoning districts you need to treat all property owners equally and fairly. So when you limit things per block or district, sometimes it creates a first one in incentive, and that may not necessarily be a good idea, but it's certainly something worth exploring.
Okay.
Any other thoughts or questions? Eli mentioned some of the other. One of the questions was what are the most important considerations when regulating ADUs, and he mentioned some, the height and building volume and bulkiness and some of the shadow issues. Are there other things other than the typical things that we're not looking at with regard to this? Or?
I just wanted to touch back on your comment about the owner occupied. So Inglewood does have that requirement for owner occupied, either one unit or the other. Is that something that's going to be reviewed as part of this ADU?
Yeah,
process?
definitely. The steering committee's kind of been discussing it and thinks that could be perhaps an unnecessary impediment, at least certainly citywide, because it seems to be an unfair burden when you're in the R2 and MUR3 districts, particularly.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess my next question is, does this ADU conversation get into a short-term rental conversation, or is that a totally separate part of the ADU question?
Yeah.
Or is that addressed elsewhere in
No, great question. It certainly sets up a scenario that encourages that. However, the standards usually are addressed separately of whether you can and can't do that. And so we will be looking at short-term rentals because the whole code is on under review. However, we haven't sensed that the city needed to change its approach to short-term rentals currently. So I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but those standards would apply independent of whether you have an ADU or not.
Thank you.
We're back.
All right.
Yes, we're back. I think it just needed a cookie or something, or was a little bit late coming back from break. So, all right.
You want to just review these quick?
Yeah, we can just review these really quick. So looks like responses on question 8. And if you do want to add your responses now, feel free to do that. How should the development code address accessory dwelling units? Proactive, allow and reduce barriers citywide. Strategic, with permitted with some limits. And not so much reactive with permitted, but and also trying to see the colors, status quo, looking a little bit light on votes. So very good. Question 9, should some lots be allowed to have more than one? So looks like many folks think that only larger lots should be allowed with more than one ADU. And then cross section of votes for the others. So, and then question 10, what things are important to regulate when considering? So parking, lot coverage, building mass and design, height and bulk plane. And interesting, density is the least. So, I think you guys are pretty insightful that all of these items really impact the shape of neighborhoods and how this type of a housing unit could fit in and maybe fit in with the context of the neighborhood. So, very good.
So our next housing issue is the consideration of smaller lot detached houses. And by smaller lot, we're talking about things that are typically in the 3,000 to 6,000 square foot range. Your current zoning districts, single family, start at a 6,000 square foot lot minimum. And then there's 3 districts that go on up from that, 6,000 to 7,200, to your lowest density one starts at 9,000. All of these zoning districts currently allow smaller lots, and they currently have smaller lots in them, but the allowances are mainly to grandfather in those existing lots, and those range anywhere from 3,000 square feet to 4,000 and 4,500 square feet, depending on the zoning district. Our interactive exercises gave you kind of some examples and scenarios of what that lot size means in comparison to what you see in the community, and showed examples of the existing ones in the community. But essentially, your code has frozen the ones that exist and not allowed any more to be created. So our question is, should you be more lenient to allowing smaller lot detached houses? And again, the idea is you can get more housing types, more unit types, but keeping the scale of development smaller and neighborhood scale.
All right, very good. So back to the interactive. Question 11, how should the development code address small lot detached houses? Should we A, allow small lots throughout the city in all residential districts? B, permit small lots, but use limiting criteria, such as allowing only in certain zoning districts or in specific arrangements on maybe on corners, the end grain of blocks, or in a courtyard type pattern? Option C, permit smaller lots, but only through specific development plans or special review. Or option D, status quo, keep the standards as they are now, and only grandfather existing lots to have those smaller types of units. So some of the feedback looking like allowing smaller lots throughout the city. Also, quite a few sentiments towards permitting small lots with limited locations. So that's corners and end grain of blocks. And a few that are identifying permitted with special review. All right. Next question still relates to the smaller lot neighborhoods. What are the important things to regulate when considering integration of small lots? Again, parking, lot coverage and open space, the height and bulk plane, building massing and design, density, or other issues. All right, so building massing and design, height and bulk plane, parking. Again, it's amazing to see how many of these issues come out very similar as far as the importance level, not really being terribly different between the two. So, you know, this is really helpful for us in being able to say, yeah, you gotta, if you're gonna do this, you need a balance of all of these items to consider helping things fit in. So. Excellent.
Okay, our next housing issue starts to look at multi-unit building formats, so duplexes, triplexes, row houses. Those become eligible in your R2 zoning district. So if you have your map, you can see where those areas are. You have 2 R2 zoning districts now, an R2A, which allows only duplexes, and an R2B, which allows multiple unit formats. The standards currently require 3,000 square feet per dwelling unit. And so what that means is a duplex has to be on a 6,000 square foot lot. A triplex would have to, or a row house with 3 units would have to be on a 9,000 square foot lot. And a 4-unit building would have to be on a 12,000 and continuing on up. So what is occurring, in our opinion, is some of these multi-unit formats are needing to be on larger and larger lots, so a larger land area basis, which then expands the eligible building footprint because of setbacks. And it also expands the eligible building volume because of your bulk plane standards. So essentially, the more units you want to build, the larger and larger your lot becomes, and the larger and larger the building's going to become. So our question is, should that be reduced or even flipped so that you don't have as high a minimum lot size per unit, but you might have a maximum lot size per building so that the building remains in a smaller scale, if that makes sense to you. Or if it doesn't, please ask and we'll clarify for you.
So the online polling, question 13, how should the development code address updating multi-unit housing types into neighborhoods? Smaller than the 3,000 square foot lot.
That lot size per unit, should we consider that?
So the answer A option would be to allow small lot multi-unit buildings in the R2 and MUR3 zones. So again, referencing back to your zoning maps in front of you. Option B, permitting that type of use, but limiting criteria only in certain districts or only in certain configurations. So that would be corners, end grain, and courtyard patterns. Option C, permitting this type of development through specific development plans. So options like a PUD, planned unit development, that is individually reviewed only. Or option D, keep the standards the same as they are now, which would require that minimum lot size of 3,000 square foot per unit for duplexes, row houses, and small apartment buildings. Okay. Yeah, good feedback. And again, a little bit of the same question regarding the important items to regulate when integrating these types. Parking, lot coverage, height and bulk plane, building massing, density, or other items. This is interesting. We've got a little bit more leaning on these types on the building massing and design, as opposed to some of the others that were a little bit more spread out and balanced on the responses. So that'll be an interesting nuance for us to be able to dig into and figure out how to approach that. So very good. Thank you.
Okay, moving on up to the building type scale to now more multi-unit buildings that go beyond the 3 and 4 unit building type. So the first is a small scale multi-unit building type. So it's an apartment. It might have anywhere from 4 to 8 units in it, but it's on a smaller lot and could be a small scale building. So in the 2 to 3 story building type, we've looked at 2 to 3 story building scale. So we've looked at examples of where that building might fit in and kind of compared it to the scale of buildings you're currently getting in your duplexes and row houses. So it's the idea that just because the building might have 4, 5, or 6 units in it, it actually might be a smaller scale building than some of the buildings you're experiencing. So that's kind of the first issue. It's the next increment up that isn't that well addressed by your current development standards. And then the next slide kind of in our online exercise it explains that in a little more detail. When we get into the MUR3 districts, the ones that are geared for mixed use or apartment building projects, the top is what the current standards would allow on a typical lot. So that's taking the setbacks, the allowable building footprint, and the height limit for each of those districts and showing what a typical building envelope would be on, I think we used a 24,000 square foot lot. And what we're finding is that each of those districts has one of those standards that sort of limits or puts an impediment into building that building. And the other thing you can see is they're all kind of basically the same scale of project. There's not a good distinction between MUR3A versus MUR3C. So if they were intending to have one be smaller scale buildings and the other be larger scale buildings, they're not necessarily doing that either. And there's more information in our online exercises. And so what we're exploring is, do we really need to think of these districts in terms of multi-unit or mixed-use buildings, really begin to think of them in small, medium, and large, or do we need all three of them? And then the last part of this is that smaller one that's on the left. That building is about the scale of the duplex and triplexes we were referring to before. So does it have a broader applicability in your community? In other words, could it fit in some of the R2 zoning districts and not just the MUR3 districts? Because again, it's a comparable scale to those other buildings we were talking about previously.
So I think we might toggle back and forth on this a little bit on the next question, because we want to ask you how you would respond to changes to this phenomenon. So the question is, how should we address those building types? Should we improve the standards for the MUR3, A, B, and C districts based on scale, so that would basically be like the bottom, to provide a little bit more scale from each of the 3 zone districts, so they're not all the same. Option B would be to consolidate all of the options into one district for limited application of larger scale projects. So if you're going to have an apartment type complex, is that just in one zone district that is allowed? Another option would be to rely on transit station area plans, downtown plans, and other specific development plans to implement larger scale apartments and mixed use projects. So that would be closer to transit stations and your downtown area. Or status quo, keep it the same as they are now and rely on PUDs or that PUD process for individual large-scale projects.
And just to clarify those last two, what I mentioned above about the existing conditions on the top, all of those have an impediment, whether it's the height setback or a density requirement that's making the MUR districts not work for that type of project. So they're being done through PUD processes. So both C and D are saying, that's fine, let's keep implementing those types of projects in these special and unique conditions rather than promote and enable them in specific and strategic locations, if that makes sense.
Do you want to ask for questions on this one? Or I think we can do it in discussion. Okay, that sounds good. Is there another question? Yeah. Well, it's the character. Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll definitely take some questions on this after when we come into open discussion, because it is one of the more complex and nuanced issues that we're dealing with. But I think the next question is going to be interesting as well. It is the same question about what things are important to regulate when integrating apartments and mixed-use building types into the community. Parking, lot coverage and open space, height and bulk plane, building massing and design, and density, or other issues. All right. We're seeing, again, a high degree of importance placed on massing and design. Parking is pretty high up there. The bulk plane and height is up there as well. Not so much on lot coverage. So, and density is a minor item as well. So, very good.
And then the last topic is kind of a broad and encompassing one that applies to all of the districts, and it deals with what will we do to promote and protect neighborhood character. We tend to think this way, and the steering committee also kind of discussed and reinforced this idea of thinking of neighborhood character in terms of both public space as being a major component to shaping character, so the streetscapes, open spaces, and frontages of how buildings and lots relate to that public space. And then the equal counterpart is private development, building type, scale and massing, frontage design, and then building design details, those increments. So this is sort of the spectrum of things we should be looking at or addressing in terms of what shapes neighborhood character. So we can, again, when we get to discussion, open discussion, we'll get a lot more into these. But just for reference, what the current code typically does is it's really just looking at the bulk plane as the main issue. So that's that idea of you have your building envelope, so your setbacks, your height, establish the box, and then the city has also adopted regulations that limit that box's impact on adjacent property by a bulk plane that essentially creates sort of a tent effect over the property. And those are the main neighborhood design standards. There's also standards that either address garages, parking, and the garage placement and orientation to the lots, and some standards on the percent of landscape in the frontage area. And there's some allowances and exceptions for some of the architectural features, such as entry features that can encroach into the setback, or projections of the building that can encroach into setbacks. But there's not requirements for some of those elements. So some of the things that you see on the right side of the screen would be allowed but not required.
So we have a new question type here. This is a rank order. So we're interested in finding out from you the things that are important to regulate and promote and protect neighborhood character. So on your phone, when you tap an option, it'll show up with an up arrow or a down arrow, and you can move that to the top of the list or down to the bottom of the list. So the options to consider are streetscape and tree canopy, landscape and setbacks, frontages and entrances, things like porches, garages and parking, height and bulk plane, and housing form and massing, as well as facade design. So the design of the front and side faces of the building. So starting to get some responses here. This one takes a little bit more thought, so we'll give it a few minutes here. We've got housing foreman Masson moving up, coming up the inside. Should have practiced my color commentary for this. All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds here. All right, so it looks like streetscape is an important factor. You know, having that unification across neighborhoods, regardless of the architecture or the housing type. Housing form and massing then coming in a close second. Height and bulk plane being important. Landscape and setbacks coming in fourth. Facade design, which is interesting. Typically, that's one of the first things that communities regulate when they're talking about character, is lower on the list, as well as frontages and entrances, and parking and garages down at the bottom. So interesting feedback. And then finally, this is our last question. We've made it through the evening here. What are the important differentiators of character for different neighborhoods within Inglewood? And we've got use, so being single family, multifamily, mixed use. Density of building types, so how many units and what size of lot. The era of development, so what year generally, what decade they were built in. Location of focal points, so areas of the city or parks that might help organize the elements. Architecture, so mid-century modern or other architectural styles or other elements. All right, very interesting. So it seems like the definition of character of different neighborhoods is really focused on location and focal points. So less about the individual buildings themselves and more about the placemaking and the elements that shape the organization and cohesion of the neighborhoods. I am also interested in the other category. That's the first time we've seen, a whole lot of responses on the other. So with that, I think we are to the summary discussion. So what do you think? And definitely we're happy to bounce back to any of those questions if you'd like to see what the slide results were to revisit. So we do have an online question. Kathleen, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I'm a little bit confused. I live in the medical district. There are a whole bunch of different buildings going up. Across from our building, there was a single family home. Now there are 12 units, and it doesn't seem like there's anything in front of it. The parking is sort of in the back, but I don't know how it got away with it.
Okay, so concerns about the frontage and maybe the relationship to the streetscape?
Yes, it seemed like they have 6 units facing each other across a tiny little walkway. And I don't know where they park because there's no parking visible from our side. So how would you consider that?
Can you repeat your question? I'm not sure I heard it.
Well, I'm confused. You talk about different sizes and what you can put on a lot and how, I don't really know the dimensions. It is in the medical district, so I don't know if there's special rules and regulations. But I just see there was a single house with a garage, so maybe it was a little bigger than a regular lot. But now there are 12 units, 6 units, and they're 4-story walk-ups.
Very good. I think one of our planners is ready to take a stab at response.
Yes. Hi. This is Brooke Bell, and in the medical district, the zoning was changed there about 12 or 13 years ago, and in that district, it's the number of units is not based so much on the size of the lot, but it's more regulated by the number of parking spots and height. And so if you're able to meet the number of parking spots that are required per unit and able to keep it within the maximum height limit, then it can be constructed. So that is an area of significant change, and that area was rezoned a number of years ago. At first, for the first few years, you really didn't see that much activity because it was during the recession. But more recently, the market has responded to those zoning changes, and you do see a lot of change in the medical district.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, discussion? We've got a couple here in the room.
All right, it's still it might be a weird question. I'm in MUR3. I have solar panels. Are these bulk plane easements taken into consideration when somebody has solar panels, allowing someone to put a large building next to them? Do they call for a review of that first? Does somebody go out and check? Or do we have anything at all in our municipal code today, because I can't find anything, that protects a homeowner's right for access to the sun?
I may not have the full example, but I would agree with you that we didn't find anything. It's been a topic of our steering committee discussions of should we, and then to answer your question on the bulk plane, it seems to be specifically geared at just regulating the building scale and not necessarily any particular access to the sun or solar protection of solar investments. But it's been brought up in our steering committee meetings.
I've talked to Brooke before about this. I'm in an R1A zone, and I didn't hear all that much about a multifamily in an R1A for obvious reasons, but mine's a non-conforming uh, uh, multifamily. It's like a duplex. It is. It's slightly more than 1,000 square feet. I'd love to be able to expand it. I've got 62 feet from the end of the building to the fence line. That's huge. I've got 18 feet on each side for setbacks. And I'm not allowed to build. I'm not allowed to change the footprint. This seems to fly in the face of the mixed density neighborhood concept. I mean, I wanted just to keep it as a ranch style, so no height issues with the neighbors. I mean, it seems like the current code, when you have an R1, is so rigid. You can't change the footprint. You can't go up. I don't even think you can go down. I don't have a basement, really. Not really. I don't. And it would just seem like if you want a diverse neighborhood, if you want to, which you claim, or at least that's what is claimed, this is a way to keep a rental, a well-maintained one. I do the work, most of it, myself that I can, but I mean that's besides the point. I mean, when you have a non-conforming type of property in an R1A, I mean you don't have to go more than a block to see these huge homes next to tiny little homes in there. That I could do if I wanted to tear down the property that I've got now and put up you know, a probably a 6,000 square foot home, no problem. It doesn't fit. But I'd be allowed to do it, I think. If I wanted to keep it as a duplex, can't do that. If I want to tear it down, and Brooke had a good point. You know, he said, well, what's to keep somebody from saying that, you know, well, if you let him do that, him being me, then why can't we do it over here? The fact is, my building was built in 1935. It's always been a duplex. I mean, to change, you know, I'm not asking to change the whole concept of what's on that property. And yet, you know, I tried back in, I think, '03. And it was, I'm sorry, you can't change the footprint. Well, this is the opportunity now to right what I believe is a wrong. And yet I didn't hear anything about R1As and ADUs. I mean, it seems like, is the point of an R1, be it R1A or R1B, whatever, just to keep it single family? And if it is, you know, then what am I doing here? You know, do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I do. I think there's a couple of complex issues that we'll need to look at. One, the non-conforming status, but I think your overall question is one of the things we've been touching on with the ADU discussion is what's wrong with multiple unit properties in R1A to begin with, and then if the distinction between R1A and R2 is more of building scale and building format, less so than the number of units. I think those kind of things are what the steering committee is going to help us wrestle with as an outcome of these discussions. And so it's not to say that the questions we've proposed or the framework is the code. So it's not like that's the direction we're heading. It's a format to have discussions like the item you just brought up.
Yeah, I think this is a related question. I was actually pretty surprised on the one of the ADU questions that it looked like the majority of people thought we should have at least, or should allow the 1 to 4 ADUs in all areas of the city. Is that what it said? No. It was all, oh, okay, 20, only larger lots, more than 1 ADU. It kind of gets to your thought though, that would actually indicate that, you know, where you have bigger lots, single family, where we don't think of having those, allowing more units. And there's a fair number of people who thought all lots should allow more ADUs. Anyway, my question is, you know, there's a trend toward just eliminating single family zoning altogether, which has been kind of a, you know, it's a very political question, but I'm curious if that's something that the steering committee has talked about at all.
We've talked about it just generally in relation to the city implementing its planning policies. We haven't brought up the whole issue of states and even some recent activities at the federal government level that are saying cities should be prohibited from limiting it to 1 family unit, and every zoning district should lots should allow at least 1 to 4 units. So we're aware of that discussion. Just to editorialize, we're personal believers in local governments and local governments making the decisions for you rather than the state or federal government. But we're aware of that issue.
Hi, it's Kathleen Neary again. I'm back. I wonder, I understand that right now the code permits these 12 units. I wonder if that could be considered as a little bit too much when you're planning. Because right now on the same block, there have been 2 apartment kind of buildings, 4-story walk-ups, and then the next block, there's going to be 118 units. So, I mean, just because we're the medical district doesn't mean that we have to be the community that takes all of any development that somebody wants to do.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think we've noted the concern about the medical district and maybe your sentiments of wondering, is that too much density? So we've taken that to note, and we'll definitely be taking that to the steering committee for discussion.
Thank you.
Did we have in the room?
Yeah, has there been any discussion that about buying and selling airspace? Yeah, I can elaborate if you want.
I guess what you're referring to is if you're allowed a certain height, selling that to somewhere else and transferring the development rights from one area to another. We haven't necessarily brought it up, but we could certainly bring that to the committee to discuss as well. Though I will say those tend to get fairly complicated from the city standpoint to track. So whether it's the right solution or not, I don't know, but it would be something we would need to be aware of. What's the administrative capability of managing that system? And then the other part of why and how you're doing it, you'd need to identify sending and receiving zones as well. But it hasn't been, so it's a good thing to bring up. Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
This happened a couple of years ago, and on a narrow lot, a 2-story building was approved, and this 30-foot building was casting a 60-foot shadow on the neighbor, and basically it went across the neighbor's property onto the next door neighbor's property. It went across the whole so basically that eliminates all the ground solar panel possibilities for that property. and the passive solar on the windows of that property. There is, I think Boulder is getting some regulations on solar access where you have a right to solar access. And Inglewood really needs to get something like that before we totally screw up everything.
Very good. Thank you for your comment. Other thoughts?
So my name is Justin. I am a developer, and so I'll try not to get stabbed on the way out of here. But my question has to do with like support for developers, and so we've done work in other municipalities where their codes and their zoning regulations become so burdensome that it becomes a detriment to developers. And I'm not saying that I'm a high-rise builder. I'm going to come and block out the sun, but I do residential development, and to have an easy to follow code is it promotes good building, and while we do want obviously good facades and take all of these other ideas into consideration, I think that development will continue to happen, and if you can, as you go through this process, maybe make it so that it meets the needs of the community, but isn't overly burdensome to developers, and not just out of town developers, but local individuals who actually maybe want to revisit their own home or do remodeling, that sort of thing.
Very good. I think one of the conversations we had during the break was how important it is to have a clear and understandable code. Over the years, as these codes get cobbled together and patches put on and band-aids and fixes, they become very unclear and sometimes don't work the way that they're intended. And so Chris and the team really do focus a lot of effort on making sure that the code is understandable, so that it is causing less time and effort and brain damage in figuring out what the rules actually are, so that you have that ability to make a decision clearly on what those standards are. So definitely taking note of your comment here.
Thank you. And then a follow-up. If I saw a couple of the comments where like a facade is important for larger developments. Is there going to be like an architectural control committee to make sure that these buildings look pretty? And if so, and maybe this is a question for the community development, is community development staffed appropriately to address stricter architectural guidelines?
No, again, we've touched on some of those issues with the steering committee. I think everyone on the committee is very sensitive to what a big step that is, both in terms of the impact on development and the processes and administrative burden it is. So kind of back to your first point, one of the big discussions is let's try to narrow down the few things that matter most to the community in terms of neighborhood character and have some really clear standards on those. That would be our preference and recommendation, rather than kind of kicking the can down the road to say, well, let's just punt it to a committee to review and decide whether it's good or not. That's kind of a risky thing that we would advise against unless you had really clear standards and that committee had the expertise to review those according to the really clear standards. That's what we would advise if we're put in that direction.
We have an online, so Bethany, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, hi, can everyone hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I had a question about how these plans to update the codes would, if at all, affect current potential projects. For example, I live kind of near the Oxford Station in a neighborhood, and we actually just had a community meeting 2 weeks ago where a developer has presented a project for public comment where they're attempting to rezone to allow a 6-story apartment building on a property that's currently occupied by a small 1-story self-storage business. And this particular property will actually end up at the end of our cul-de-sac and share a fence line with backyards of my neighbors. And so I'm just curious, since there's some consideration of rezoning, especially in the large, the large scale buildings, if there's a potential that a project could potentially be outside this, the direction of the new zoning codes, is there a potential that these projects would be halted, or will it not impact like current projects that are in flight right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can explain that the general rule is no, it doesn't impact that because we aren't even sure what the new standards are yet till we get through this process and begin drafting them and reviewing them. So they don't come into effect until they're adopted and in place. And so that's a decision for further down the road on A, when the city formally adopts this, and then B, when they take effect. But we are aware of different strategies that communities do when there's current things in the pipeline impacting them. They're just outside of the scope of this project. But I can give the outsider's general answer that no, these discussions aren't impacting things currently in the pipeline.
And then I just had one last follow-up question. So I know that there's, some planning ideas for the industrial area that does surround the Oxford station. Is there any consideration of maybe kind of easing into the dense type of buildings, for example, like surrounding those types of developments with maybe like an R2, where you don't just go single family to a large scale building that have, when people are in their balconies looking into your backyard? I feel like there might be more support. For example, there's some industrial buildings near me, and I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to having like townhomes or things that are just not quite as intrusive as having a giant apartment building go up where we've normally had privacy throughout the years we've owned our home.
Yeah, another good question. And again, I'll answer it from the outsider's perspective. That is one of the overall goals. As was brought up, the idea of mixed density neighborhoods, the idea is blending a lot more compatible building types so you get more effective transitions. I think what's happening right now is because that middle to higher scale building type currently isn't addressed well in the code, a lot of the pressure, and this is, I don't have like data to support this, but just anecdotally, a lot of the pressure is going to PUD projects, which are large scale buildings. Whether I think that will probably continue to some extent, but one of the reasons we want to broaden the range of building types within these zoning districts is so that better transitions can be created. I think your specific question on the Oxford station is more of a planning issue than a code issue. But if we set the code up to do that better, I think some of those planning decisions could be made down the road that begin to transition and filter building types better.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, we're getting close to our time here. And Bethany, I want to thank you for giving us a little bit of a leading question about when would these standards be determined? When might they take effect? And really, that is part of the upcoming process. As Chris mentioned, the standards haven't been defined yet, so we've got a lot of work ahead of us over the next several months. And Chris, do you want to explain a little bit of the upcoming process?
Yeah, so with this input, and the input will continue to get over the next 2 weeks through our online engagement. Again, all of these questions are going to be available tomorrow on Inglewood Engage through surveys for people who didn't participate tonight. We're going to take that feedback back to our steering committee, kind of start reaffirming the direction. From there, we will start creating initial drafts of code language. And so those will be working with staff, a technical committee of broader staff people beyond the planning department, and some other stakeholders in the community to bring together initial draft, at which case we'll gather and have another public forum, probably an open house, to kind of look at some of the preliminary drafts and ideas. From that input, we'll prepare a final draft that then sort of shapes our formal recommendation to the city, and then that will set us up for a more formal public process to adopt it, which also has public hearings required with it. So that's how we're proceeding from our diagnosis to our line to launch, where we officially start drafting code language. So stay tuned to Inglewood Engage and the CodeNext website to stay engaged with those issues.
Very good. So if we can move on to the next slide here, we do have the Inglewood Engaged platform, which does have more deep dives into the topics that we talked about tonight. If there's something that maybe you heard that piqued your interest, there's likely a lot more information. Additionally, the issue papers with more explanation of some of the things to think about with respect to these issues are also available online for additional thought and consideration. And that platform online does have question opportunities. So if you have questions that come up, comments that come up that you'd like to feed into this process, please do consider sending that in through that platform, as well as we've provided the phone number here for the planning department. So with that, thank you for bearing with our technical issues, and it was pretty exciting to see that feedback coming back and kind of get a sense of where your thought processes are. And we appreciate your staying engaged throughout this process. It really is important to have your feedback and your direction guiding the future of the community. So, staff, any closing comments?
Everyone can hear me? Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and participating both in person and online. We're thrilled that our technology did work. We really appreciate everybody participating and hope you will continue to participate. And again, the place to go to first is that Inglewood Engaged website, and you can look through the papers. You can engage with questions or comments. And again, that survey will still be up for the next few weeks. So thank you all very much for coming. And if there's any cookies left, grab some. I don't know if there are, but thank you for coming, and drive carefully or walk carefully.